If you're a B2B business, a B2B tech company, or a B2B marketer, you're in the right place. Coming to you from Studio 26, this is the Interesting B2B Marketers Podcast, bringing you interesting contemporary takes, industry tips, guest interviews, and true stories from B2B marketers in the trenches. Now, here's your host, Steve Goldhaber.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to Studio 26. And the show today, I am joined by Sarah Wallace. Sarah's got a really interesting background. She's worked at Oracle. She's worked at Forrester, a whole bunch of other places too. Been doing it over 20 years. So Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Steve, for having me. I'm very honored. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, as we know, we always like to start out interesting B2B marketers with stories. So the first one you're going to share with us has to do with, it's kind of a cool story, right? It's a wearables story by someone who's getting into a market that was new. They were a new entrant, even though they had some interesting technology. So I'm gonna let you take it away. Tell us about the story.
Sure. So I was doing social media campaigns for an automotive company. They came out with a wearable tracking device that could be used by anyone who might wander or get lost. So typically this type of person might be categorized as someone who's maybe elderly, someone that might have dementia or Alzheimer's, or maybe someone that has maybe a child that has autism. They knew they were going to be launching this wearable device in probably 6 months or so, and they wanted to somehow connect with companies that were associated with these communities so that when they did release the device, everyone was already kind of aware that it was coming on the market and there would be excitement and there would be partnerships. But having been in the automotive industry for so long, they just didn't have any ties. So they hired me to connect with these different communities. Again, the timeline was about 6 months. So what I did was, in both communities, I also didn't have much involvement with. So I did a lot of due diligence. I started following prominent associations in both areas. Started following, concerns, what were the trending topics. And then on behalf of this customer, started liking things maybe on social media, like on Twitter, retweeting them, starting to become part of the conversations, connecting and sharing things with people in these communities. And then started to mention that this tracking device was coming out. So I would say probably 3 months into this and, building rapport and relationships, started to announce that this device was going to be coming out. What was unique about this device was that it could actually be submerged in water and still work, which was a big deal because a lot of times people, when they wander for whatever reason, they might be attracted to water. And by the time they launched this device, it was nice. We had rapport in a lot of the different social media accounts. So when they did launch it, a lot of the communities in both these areas were very excited about it.
I was going to say, when you were doing that, was it you were using their existing account, or did you create like sub accounts or build something organically from the ground up?
It was a sub account, but it had their company logo, which is very recognizable, and it had like a underscore and then the name of the device that was coming out.
Okay, and I assume that helped speed things up as far as like getting some traction.
Yes, and they were justifiably concerned too because you associate this logo with automotive needs. So it was really, I've been working and doing social media campaigns and monitoring probably since 2009, 2010. And, in my mind, this is a really good example of the sort of like slow, steady, really building your network and becoming part of a community. And then, even afterwards, so after they started selling it, working with these different associations to distribute it for both of these needs. And it really wasn't something that we expected, but then someone say, oh, my grandfather was lost and we live in Florida. He got lost. And because of this device, we were able to find him. So then it kind of became an after, they would use the hashtag of the device after. So I'd say in terms of social media, it's probably one of the most rewarding campaigns I've ever worked on, just because it was a device that, was helping two very important communities.
So how did you, you did the launch? Did they continue to use social to continue and engage, or was it more of like a traditional launch campaign where it's like, well, we did a build up, we launched it, and then we moved on? How'd they approach it after it?
So I was still doing social media for that campaign, probably I'd say 6 months after the launch, only
Okay.
because they were starting to get feedback and more engagement. And then as I was, the example of people being found, which I think is great, right? They didn't just launch it and forget it. They continued the engagement.
It's just interesting, companies in social media, sometimes brand teams have that vision for the account and they tend to be grounded in advertising principles. And then other times, truly people who understand social media and community are managing them. In your experience culturally, how did they want to use social? Or was it some mixture of both?
They actually didn't have much use of social, right? So they had a Facebook account they didn't do much with. They had Twitter. And I think what they were doing on there was pretty minimal. They did, maybe post some updates now and then, but they weren't really engaging at the time. So this sub account was really the first time they were actively engaging. And I also used some social media monitoring tools to be able to measure sentiment on their corporate account, their existing account, and also
Okay.
on the sub account, which they were like, oh, wow. So, they like actually monitoring the sentiment and seeing that the
Yeah.
engagement really helped increase awareness. So
I've always been fascinated by the sentiment tools. I'm always a little suspicious because I don't know today or even back then, like, have they cracked the code for the sarcasm and the trolls that live online?
right,
And not so
right.
much on the account that you're talking about, but anytime I was presented with sentiment data, it was really hard to kind of like classify. And you have to really get into the weeds to go in and say, well, can you show me the log where you have said these keywords are generally positive and these are negative or neutral? But it is fascinating to see, like, when we use sentiment to compare brands of competitors, like, what is that love-hate relationship with people? It just brings another qualitative dynamic into the conversation.
Yeah, I agree. And I remember back then when I was doing a lot of social media monitoring, even reading about, statistically, if people are talking about a brand on social, it's probably because they're complaining about them.
Mm-hmm.
So, even taking that kind of thing into account.
All right, cool. Anything else about the first story before we jump into the next one?
I would just say the other thing that I learned with that was patience, right? So I'm a very pragmatic, if you do this, this will be the end result. And I think, waiting months and months to see the result and slowly build something was a good lesson for me about patience, and something like that, building that network does take time.
All right, let's jump into story number 2. This one has to do, it's a retail story, specifically involving Gen Z. So take it away on story number 2.
Sure. So I was working at a startup, a tech startup that had a platform that was able to serve all different types of verticals. They really wanted to penetrate the retail industry. They actually already had an impressive roster of some major retail chains, but they were making an appearance at NRF, which is the National Retail Federation show, held every beginning of every year in January at Javits Center, New York City. So really wanted to kind of put themselves on the map. So I actually started the company in November. So they said, Sarah, we're going to NRF in January. Let's do something to kind of like really have a presence there. So I did a retail survey asking consumers about retail and, their sentiment about buying, purchasing. Big topic at that time was, in-store versus online, versus like pop-up stores. What were consumers preferring? And I really wanted to be able to do different demographics, so different age groups. And at the time, I might be a little bit biased. My kids are Gen Z, so I said, I really want to include Gen Z. But at the time, a lot of Gen Z were under 18, and for them to complete the survey, they actually had to get their parents' permission. And, we were a little bit in a time crunch. So at one point I almost gave up and I thought, I don't know if we're going to be able to do this if we have to wait for Gen Z to fill in. But we waited and we pushed a little bit more and we were able to fill in Gen Z. And the great thing is, so we did a press release kind of highlighting some of the results, and we got press coverage in not only just retail publications, some niche retail publications, but also media like Forbes and US News Report. And, I think I don't know that anyone had done a Gen Z retail survey at the time, but it just really got picked up. So by the time we did get to NRF, people were coming to the booth and wanting a copy of the report. We had Microsoft and IBM retail divisions approach us and ask if they could work with us maybe on the next report. And I believe both became channel partners. So I guess both personally and just in terms of the B2B, it's just an example of kind of pushing and trying to do something that's maybe unique at the time really paid off. So.
Yeah, I'm a huge believer in research being really interesting content. I think companies will default so often to just, here's our opinion on something. Let's publish a case study or a white paper. And anytime I've seen a company do research, it's new, interesting stuff. And you can talk about the data and no longer is your role as the B2B marketer as I am the expert in this area. It's just, we fielded some research. There's some really interesting things we're sharing and have a look. It's not as much of a marketing pitch. And so many companies have kind of done that approach where it's like the annual survey that you do, and then you start to get a backlog of years to compare the data. And then all of a sudden, the classic example I always go to is the Edelman Trust Barometer, right? Like they have just owned that space and they probably have 10, 15 years of data on that thing. And it's kind of like, who can touch that now? Like they own all that trend data. So I love that. I love that approach.
Yeah.
What are some things that surprised you from your research learnings about the Gen Z audience?
What really surprised me, and millennials and Gen Z, I thought this answer would be the opposite. We posed the question, and at the time, there was rumor that Amazon might be opening physical stores. So we said, would you prefer to go to shop online at Amazon.com or go into an Amazon physical store? And the younger generations chose the in-store experience, which was surprising.
That's pretty interesting. Yeah. For as native to digital, those in-store experiences are helpful. I was shopping recently at one of the Amazon, I think it's called Amazon Fresh. It's not the like quick to go version where you just walk in and out, but it's the legit grocery store. Same concept where you just, you scan to get in and you don't have to check it out. But it's just a whole fascinating model where you're applying that much digital thinking into retail. And it was fun. I've done it several times, but it's still a very novelty. And I always have the feeling like I'm stealing food when I leave the store. I'm looking around suspiciously like, are you going to arrest me? Because I'm just leaving with this food.
Well, it's funny when, even when I just go into a regular retail store and they say, do you want a receipt? And I don't really need the receipt, but I usually say yes because I feel odd walking out of the store with merchandise with no receipt. I feel like I'm just stealing and walking outside. So I'll even say to the cashier, I'll say, actually, I will have a receipt so it doesn't look like I'm stealing something. And they'll start laughing.
It is. I know it is. It's such a weird feeling because like you're used to like shopping, receipt, bag, and they would look at the bag that you have and you'd at least say, well, I have a bag from your store. So clearly I didn't just leave without paying. But yeah, it's a fascinating thing. I wonder how much research has been done about like adopting that cashless register experience. And it's like, how do you get people comfortable with not having that awkward feeling that they're stealing stuff?
Yes.
Anyway, maybe that's our next research.
Yeah. And also what do the younger generations, does that even bother them? Do they even think anything of it?
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thanks for sharing the story with us. Let's jump into how you got started in B2B marketing. What was the first decision, the first, project that you worked on in the space?
Well, I honestly can't remember the first project per se, but I I think it was probably 2010, 2011 is when I was actually working as an industry analyst, but doing a lot of custom work. And, with all these major tech companies that were like, we're coming out with a new solution. We want to sell it to these enterprises. We need thought leadership and, end to end everything. So even from, can you help us name the solution? Help us with the messaging, the thought leadership, and then, going to a conference and helping present it. Maybe doing a blog post for them about it as well. So even though I was positioned as an analyst, I was working with CMOs and directors of solution marketing. And, I was doing maybe 4 different campaigns at a time for about 5 years. So I think was my kind of dive into B2B marketing. Even though it wasn't my title, I was helping all these CMOs with exactly that. So
yeah. How did you, so here's the struggle I believe every analyst goes through it's almost like the church and state argument, right? Like there's the data, we need to tell the story about this topic. And then the marketer comes in and is trying to either alter that information to make their service or their product seem better. Like describe that struggle that you kind of have experienced with the church and state separation.
Oh yeah, especially if I did a survey and, the vendor would have a hypothesis of like, we're coming out with this product because the market needs it. And then I do the survey and then the end users would be like, we don't really anticipate that as a revenue generator for us in the next 5 years. So a lot of times the results were not what the vendor wanted or was expecting. However, the good thing about surveys is that you can ask more detailed questions. So, so they would say, yeah, not really. However, when you dig deeper and you say why, and they would say, well, we don't really feel like we have the back office systems to support that right now.
Yep.
So, so then you kind of like flip it on its head and be like, okay, well, even though this can be a major revenue generator in the future, this many end users feel like they don't have the back office systems, and this vendor's coming out with that support.
Yeah. Yeah, and research too. It is fascinating how you do have to go deeper into it because sometimes people don't know what you're doing, right? Like, and you can't always share everything about a new product. So there are, and sometimes there's always obviously like there's the research bias of just sometimes people tell you positive things. That's certainly, at least when I did focus groups, people want to please, right? Like, oh, well, let me tell you about how I will want this or how I like this. So that was always an interesting factor of what's the right thing. I did a lot more focus groups as it relates to like ad campaigns, which was also kind of scary because sometimes it's like, should the people in this focus group be dictating what's the best concept? Like their ability to understand the marketplace, you had to question it saying like, well, they might like this more, but is it going to work? So it's always that balance of kind of like research is an endpoint or an input as opposed to a, like the final sign off. I think the challenge that some of the clients I worked with in the space, some were there to learn, some were there for an insurance policy, meaning they had a lot of money behind a campaign and they wanted the consumer sign off to say like, we give you the thumbs up, launch the campaign. And it really became this thing of just a get out of jail free card to say like, well, the people I shared it with liked it. So, but anyway, I'm getting very political here with my research. But yeah, there's always that struggle of what do you do when the research doesn't tell a good story? And sometimes, if you've got 10, 15 questions, if you get 1 or 2 really interesting stats, sometimes that's a win because then that stat, you can lead with that as a hook just to get people into the whole idea. Tell me more about like my guess is you've done more on the long form side. What's your kind of like, as you approach a piece of long form content, how do you think about it? Are you jumping to the outline? Are you jumping to the problem? How do you think about the early stages of long form?
Yeah. So let's say I'm hired or, I'm doing like a 9 to 16 page white paper, thought leadership white paper. And it's really not necessarily focused on the solution, but just more I guess I think of it as an inverted pyramid. So, kind of a broader of, here's the space right now, and then down to like, what are the pain points for people in this space? And then, what can help with these pain points? And then either, talking about the company and what they offer or not talking about it. I guess, if I had to do a visual, that's how I think about like an inverted pyramid.
I like that. And the pain is definitely, that helps me in content creation too. What I've observed about clients I've worked with is like the ones who truly embrace the content marketing vision of not really selling, just helping, is they gravitate to the pain and they just push the solution as far down as they can in that content. One software company I'm working with now is, they're like, you know what, this is a 12, 14 page piece of thought leadership. The last page is when we want you to even mention the product. So it's culturally, that's so fascinating to me, is like, you have some clients who just are all about like, no, we don't want this to be seen as salesy. And then I have another client where they're like, hey, we're 30% into this piece of content and like, we're not talking about ourselves, like, it's like,
yes.
good or bad, it's fascinating to see how, and it's, to me, in my experience, it's all driven by culture. Is how are people using content? Is it the sales department trying to creep into the content, or are you a purist and you truly view content as helpful so that when they're done with it, people kind of go, oh yeah, this was a great piece. Who did this? What do they do? It's a hard thing to kind of feel out for what the best approach is.
Yeah, I had that happen. I did a white paper for an AI company. The paper was mostly thought leadership. And then a stakeholder jumped in at the last minute and, because he had editing rights, and he sprinkled product mentions all through it, just these sort of like, anyway. So then the first stakeholder said, what are you doing? Sarah wrote this awesome piece of thought leadership and you're ruining it. And I was just like, so they actually had it out. Okay. I was like, okay, it was two very, very strong opinions on it. So I think in the end, there was a little bit of a compromise, but the first stakeholder was not happy because, you read 2 paragraphs and all of a sudden there's this ad for one of their solutions. But
it's funny.
Yeah, exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's funny because sometimes like we'll work with a bunch of clients and they'll push us a certain way, and then we'll fall into that trap of like, okay, our content's moving this way. And then you start doing that for another client and you're like, wait a second, we can't do that for this client. They don't like it's funny to keep track of that. One thing, as it relates to long form content is, I'd love to get your thoughts on this too, is I was doing like a trend report for a client recently, and they had a struggle too with this, like, is it short form? Is it long form? Is it somewhere in the middle? And my advice to them as it relates to long form, because the argument always goes something like this: no one has time to read long form. Like, people just aren't going to spend 10 minutes or 15 minutes to read something. And what I enjoy about long form, especially if you're publishing on online, is that there's SEO benefits. You have the room to be an expert. So you don't have to just talk about something in 1,000 words or 1,500 words in a blog post. You can really get into some domain authority about what you're talking about. And the other thing I kind of challenged them on is, I said, look, if you've got a 10 or 15 page white paper, the goal is not necessarily to have everyone finish that white paper. If only half the people finish it, to me, that's a win. And the people who didn't finish it, they still look at your organization as someone who is an authority, because you have to have that authority to write a lengthy white paper. So I think that's what I've encouraged clients to think about, not only the like diminishing readership through the piece, but if you have a long form piece and half or a third of the people get to the end, like, those are your people who are interested, and you have to serve them. The people who stopped halfway, they're not ready. So don't worry that they stopped. So anyway, I'd love to get your thoughts on like would you agree with that? Do you have another opinion on like, the way to think about readership through a longer piece.
I do agree with that. And even me personally. So, because I'm constantly working with words, like people make fun of me because I'll say I don't read books, and I don't because I'm looking at words all day. I just don't feel like looking at words when I'm relaxing. But so, for instance, I love the New Yorker. If I see something on Instagram that they've posted an article about something, I'll kind of like bookmark that post, and then when I have time later, I'll go back and I'll read the whole story. So, and I do think even if you have a white paper and it's in your resources on your website, and especially if the title of the white paper is reflecting really what it's about, so you can say how to overcome these problem areas or these challenges, and then people will be like, oh, we've been struggling with that. That's really interesting that they've written this in-depth paper about it. And yeah, you hope they would come back and read it, but as you were saying, it kind of reflects your expertise. And I did a white paper for a company based in Europe, and they said, Sarah, we had this big deal with prospective deal with this operator in India, and they were kind of on the fence, and we gave them your white paper. And they were literally like, all right, let's do this. And I was like, really? Because I do all this kind of work for these large tech companies, but I never kind of get the follow-up. So I was like, oh my gosh, really? And he's like, yes. So
yeah, it's crazy, the power of long form content. In my own business, it surprises me when I do marketing. Like my book is the ultimate long form piece of content. And I've had people that it's kind of funny. I've been trying to target this one business for a while. They haven't engaged much, but the head marketer downloaded my book, and I don't know if they read it all or they just read, 20, 30 pages of it. But they told me this on a call recently, and they were just like, oh yeah, you don't even have to talk about your philosophy. I know it. And they were referencing all these things in the book. And it was a nice reminder of like, yeah, long form content helps you get your philosophy out there, and it's the authority aspect. Hey, this guy wrote a book, he's got to be an authority on it. How did he fill up 300 400 pages in a book? So yeah, I'm a big believer in not to ignore short form, but like long form has its place. Don't shy away because something is just going to take a long time to be created.
And especially even if it's in my white papers, there's different sections, right, that have subtitles. So maybe they're really anxious to read more about this one subsection, right? I had a industry research report that I did. I'd say it was like 25 pages. I was kind of creative, and I did this chart comparing vendors in this certain area. A major Canadian cable operator, emailed our research company and said, we want that report, but we really just want the chart. So can we just get the chart? We'll pay for it. And I was like, no, they don't want the rest of the report. And I was like, so yeah, I mean, it might even just be a particular piece of content in your long form that sticks out to you.
I've seen some companies embrace maybe what I'll describe it as an open source content philosophy. So like in that example, you have research or something that you're writing about, but then I've also seen more companies just publish the data in literally like an Excel spreadsheet, and to say, if you want access to the data, please come get it here. And I've always been fascinated with that. You lose a little bit of the control over the material, but you're genuinely helping someone. And that's also part of content marketing is you guys were smart enough to realize that I actually wanted the data. Thank you.
And there's that huge debate. Should this content be gated or not? Right.
Yeah. Where do you stand? Yes. Maybe there's not a one size answer for that, but what do you feel about the gated argument?
Yeah, I don't know. So, when I worked at the smaller startup on the marketing team, and when I worked at Oracle, some people, and honestly, I don't know what the right answer is. But what I have observed, and tell me if you've observed this, that you can have the most experienced CMO, but they're hemming and hawing about it too. Like I feel like everyone struggles like whether to gate this or that. I mean, do you observe that?
I always observe the struggle. I think everything is unique. If I had to come up with like an overarching philosophy, I would say do a little bit of both. If you have 2 or 3 pieces of content that you know are amazing, like it's something that no one else can do, I would go with gating it. And then the rest of the content, purely just from like the advantages of SEO, is ungate that stuff. And I think that because it's always hard, but if you're committed to something, and if some marketers aren't into the SEO game, but if you are, to publish that without gating it is just such an advantage, especially the long form stuff, because that's gonna rank better. All right, well, tell me about just a couple more questions for you here. I'm going to call this the love-hate question. What do you love about B2B marketing? What do you hate about it?
So I love helping company, whether it be smaller or, a large enterprise. I think it's really professionally a great experience to help them bring something new to the market. Just because even, not just the marketing team, but the developers, everyone that's worked on that. And then when you help them bring it to market, it's all the things that they've been working on for months are coming to fruition. So I really enjoyed that aspect. I think what I don't like is just maybe when there's internally some struggle, right? So as I gave the example before, the stakeholders that had the conflict of opinion, or if there's someone that I'm working with and they change their opinion or they're indecisive, that part I don't like.
Okay, so one final question for you, Sarah. Tell me about looking back. If you were to teach yourself, or if you were to talk to someone new in the B2B marketing world, what's the best advice you would give to them?
I would say to my younger self or someone who's, entering B2B marketing, I feel like every company kind of has their own personality or culture, how they approach things, and just to take that into consideration. And there's so many different personalities that you're going to work with. I've worked with some major tech companies and they'll have, 12 stakeholders on the kickoff call, and they all have varying opinions, and you can tell the process might take a while. And then I've had the other companies that, they assign one stakeholder to work with me one-on-one, and that person makes pretty quick decisions and it wraps up pretty efficiently. So I think just bear in mind, every company or team has their own kind of culture, and, don't take it personally. So I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it's good advice. I think you can, the really good content marketers understand that the actual content is kind of half the challenge. The other half is, to your point, the culture and the structure of the company, and having the foresight to kind of think about potential obstacles. Well, does the CMO understand this? Do they want it to be more pure content versus sales enablement? Fleshing those out early on so that you don't get frustrated. Because, to me, the love-hate part of content is like, it usually takes a while. Like the good content takes time. So understanding, I always try to diffuse any bombs before they explode on projects, because like you put a lot of effort into content and you want to avoid that bomb exploding weeks down the road where it was like, well, you never said this.
Right.
But yeah, that makes sense. All right. Well, Sarah, I really enjoyed the conversation. I'm inspired to create more long form content after talking today. Maybe I'll think about the next long form content for my own business. But thanks again for joining, and everyone else, thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to the Interesting B2B Marketers podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you heard this podcast so you never miss an episode. If you found value in today's episode, please help grow the podcast by sharing with others and leaving a review. We'll see you next time.